context, roughly speaking, going through what I mean by secure DevOps at scale, and in particular, looking at the context in which I experienced having to scale up a DevOps organization and do it in a secure way. And that was when I was working at HMRC between 2011 and 2016. And I'll start off by laying out what we did there, what some of the challenges were, and then sort of setting out how we went about addressing those. So the second section will actually look at specific things we did and I led on to address some of those problems. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at the kind of organizational and interaction elements of doing secure DevOps at scale. And then thirdly, there's an opportunity at the end to ask some questions. If you ping any questions into the box at the bottom of the screen, then in the box on the side of the meeting screen, then I can get those questions, and I'll leave some time to answer them at the end. So as we're going along, anything you think of, just pop it in there. So as I said, some of the things that I'll cover, I'm going to look at some of the challenges that we face specifically in growing our DevOps approach at HMRC. I'm going to look at the approach I used to do DevOps with security as we scaled, so the kinds of techniques and things we did, and the kinds of approaches we took to the problems that we faced as we were growing. And finally, there's going to be some examples along the way of more specific things that we did. Although I must say the focus is not on the examples as such; it's more on the kind of structural and, as I said, organizational things that we did to make DevOps work at scale in an environment where it had to be secure. So just for a moment, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I've done subsequently. So post leaving HMRC in February of last year, of 2016, I started up a company called DRIE, and we are working through some of the problems that we learnt from at HMRC with other organizations and putting in place tooling to try and make it easier for organizations that have a security need to enable DevOps practices in their organization. And we do that in two ways. One of the ways we do that is by providing consultancy, both technical consultancy and organizational consultancy to build things, including good practices, governance, organizational good practices, and also technology that can underpin that. And some of the things I'll be talking about is really where we've learnt our trade as a company, and sort of taken that out into other organizations similar to HMRC. The second thing we do, and we're just about to launch this in the next month or so, is that we have a platform as a service that we've built that composes AWS components. So it uses cloud components provided by AWS that have sort of high quality security credentials, but composes them in a way that makes it easier to do some of the core DevOps practices that we all know and love. So that's things like continuous deployment, continuous integration, and building secure development environments. So if you're interested in either of those things, my contact details will be at the end of the email, and please do get in touch if there's anything interesting that you hear throughout the session today. So let's get started with context. What I'm going to do is explain a little bit about what we did at HMRC and what the context was for what we were doing. But actually, I kind of think it's interesting to address this question to begin with. Why is it even interesting to talk about secure DevOps at scale? Why is this a topic that I've devoted many hours of thinking towards, and also kind of a substantial amount of my work life to kind of addressing? Well, I think it's got something to do with the following. So I'm not going to go into too much of the internecine wars about what DevOps means and how the best ways to implement it are, and exactly what we should be battling over when we use the word. But what I am going to say is that I think a core component of what DevOps is all about is flow. So if we think back to how IT organizations operated and still do operate outside of a DevOps context, the general problem that we've seen and that we see DevOps trying to solve is the idea that there is a block between two teams that essentially should have the same outcome in mind, right? So development teams and operations teams in an organization, we think, should have the same goal, common goal, which is to build great stuff for that organization, right? To build great software and to make sure that it works well for the users who use that software for that organization. The patterns that we saw that DevOps emerged from were really when those two teams were not operating together, right? So when development teams and operations teams were disconnected, disjointed, they worked separately and they didn't see their work as being part of a common goal, we saw blockages, slowdowns and kind of long lead times and a lot of difficulty in the software development, delivery and operations world between when we were actually trying to get products out the door. DevOps has kind of improved that by bringing those two groups close together to try and achieve flow through the software development lifecycle, right? So actually, the thought that how we get software written from the point of, say, the first entry point, the first thing that you do, all the way through to how that's going to be run, how it's going to be run effectively in a production setting, and what the kind of feedback loops are that for the initial parts of the process. Those are really the things that we're trying to kind of optimize when doing DevOps. And that can be sort of construed or considered in terms of the flow, right? We're trying to make sure that software, that products, that good stuff that we're building kind of flows through that software delivery lifecycle, and then gives us information that we can take back to the beginning and feed back into that process. That's quite a long setup for this slide, which I like, which is that, in my opinion, security is not about flow, or at least it hasn't been, or it's not enough about flow right now, or that's not really how it's construed in organizations. So really, in some ways, we see ourselves, when we bring security into the mix of delivering software, we see ourselves in a similar position as we did when DevOps, I guess, was setting out, where security teams in organizations are not in general bought into enhancing the flow of delivery of software through organizations. And I guess that sort of core idea is why it's interesting to start talking about that, because we see that organizations that got to do this from scratch, or got to do it from the ground up, or are very small, were able to kind of get around this problem a bit by kind of inventing security on the fly. But for those of us who work in organizations that have a large and established kind of security profile, it's not as easy to just kind of ignore the needs of that kind of team and what they're looking for. And really, that leaves us in a position where our attempts to do DevOps can be scuppered by people who aren't bought into what we're doing and are not sort of helping us establish that flow of software through the processes. And I guess this is where we see the feeling of security being a blocker to new ways of doing things, or security being difficult to achieve in these kinds of environments, is, I think, in part due to seeing security in the wrong way, not as an enabler of the flow software and of products and of things that we're building and into that process, but actually as sitting outside of that process and kind of putting in place some sort of challenging things that we have to sort of jump over. So that is really, I think, why it's interesting to talk about security in a DevOps context, because people are finding it difficult to integrate security into the work that they're doing, into the great achievements that they're getting out of adopting DevOps practices. So that's one side of the title, was kind of security and DevOps. The other side is scale. And to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about scale, I kind of will give I'll start to sort of situate what I'm going to talk about, the work that I did at HMRC Digital. So in 2014 in HMRC Digital, we started off a kind of pilot program, a digital transformation program, to build better services for the taxpayers. And the kinds of services that emerged from this would meet the government digital services new standards for building online services, for building really excellent experiences for users that enabled people to get things done more easily than previously. And in HMRC, the real driver for this kind of investment and, I guess, transformation in the digital space was the cost of not doing it well. So I guess everybody's had an experience where they've had to do a tax return or have some kind of obscure tax issue, and the way that typically people tend to resolve these issues is by getting on the phone. And whilst HMRC's call staff are brilliant, and once you get through to them, they tend to be very, very good, a lot of the situations that they deal with are actually quite simple to resolve at other parts of the value chain. So really, we should be able to offer either services or to kind of know enough about people's situations from an automated fashion to reduce the amount of time that people spend on the call. And then we can try and and then the aim was to try and reduce the number of overall calls that HMRC was receiving, so that call center staff and people who were working behind the scenes there could spend their time on the stuff that was more valuable, like the really difficult cases where people really need more expert help. So in order to do that, HMRC put a big investment behind building digital services, and the kind of thing, the way that they started off was in a small kind of pilot way with 4 teams who were building some 4 new digital services, and to kind of show that we could deliver rapidly effective and useful things for the public. Now, the bit of our kind of journey at HMRC Digital that I'm going to focus on in the remainder of the webinar is not that initial sort of trial period, that period where we were kind of getting things off the ground and doing our first bits of work there. But what I am going to focus on is what happened once people decided that was successful, and that was a good idea. And what happened when people decided that those first 4 services were a good idea was that they got very excited about doing a lot more of them. So what senior leaders in HMRC, when they saw the success of the initial services, and they saw the kind of speed and quality that we were able to deliver by using contemporary software delivery practices, they wanted more of that. And that's a very natural thing, I think, to want. They saw a lot of success coming out of those services, and they saw us achieving a lot of the goals that we were looking for. By making things easier to do online, we were decreasing, for specific targeted areas, we were decreasing the amount of people who had to get on the phone, because they were it's more easy for them to do what they needed to do online. This led to a rapid growth in the number of developers and development teams and product teams working in HMRC Digital in about a 9-month period between 2014 and 2015. What we saw was we moved from a small amount of teams in one location to a much larger number of teams. And these were teams of multidisciplinary teams consisting of developers, of project leads and product owners, of testers and user researchers and designers, each one of which was given the task, each one of those teams was given the task of building a part of the HMRC digital service of the future. What did we want our interaction with taxpayers to look like? What that meant was we had a fast proliferation in software development, in code, in people, and in the services that we were running for the taxpayer in quite a short time. So some of the things that we saw in that change was that we went from a small, highly co-located team that had quite a deep well of knowledge that had been built up through working closely together across development and operations and other areas really. But this is kind of how DevOps kind of changed. So we went from having actually very high bandwidth, conversation-based interactions between ops teams and development teams, because we were all geographically co-located, to having, and there were a small number, so there were enough people that everybody could know who everybody else was. You could draw on expertise very quickly, and you could do that, largely speaking, just by walking across the office. What we moved to was a geographically distributed, much larger team. So we went from having around 50 to 60 people to having several hundred people, all of whom were trying to achieve the same kinds of outcomes, but all of whom, but many of whom came to that thing, came to this project new, and didn't have the benefit of that first 6 to 12 months of really that embedded knowledge of what we were doing, of how we worked, of what our standards were, and how we went about delivering software between development and operations teams. We also found, and I think this is a very kind of realistic point that is sometimes missed when we look at the vast scale operations that people like Google and Amazon and Netflix, people like that run, where there's a large amount of, effort, money, and sort of skill behind engineering teams, was that we had a very distributed set of skills and experience. So in going from a team of about 50 or so engineers to a team of about 300 engineers, we were naturally going to have a much wider distribution of skills, particularly when we weren't able to, say, pay or offer the attractions that a Google or a Netflix could offer. So actually what we found was not only were we more distributed, but also we had a wider range of skills, and people knew about different things. The final thing that was kind of interesting in this space was that we'd obviously been reasonably coddled in that initial period, and chosen very carefully some projects that we could mold and move forward in our own way. Right now that it was a success and it was going to grow, we found that business areas all over the place were popping up with ideas for what they wanted to do, and this was great. This was exactly what we wanted to happen in HMRC, but it meant that there were a lot more different kinds of things being pushed into the world of digital development, software development, and operations than there had been before. And we've been reasonably lucky, and also had the safe space of choosing what we did to a certain extent. So that's kind of what I mean by scale. And I guess just to sort of kind of round off the kinds of things that we were aiming to do in this space. So the metrics that we were looking to meet through our software delivery world were along these lines. So when we talk about DevOps, what we were talking about was to make sure that teams could get started very, very quickly. So teams could have working software in all environments in around about a day. So that was one of our targets, and one that we achieved by the end of this process, was that we wanted every team, as it arrived, to be able to push software to environments that it needed for testing, for development, and indeed for production within a day. So all of that to be set up in an automated fashion. We also wanted that teams to have the temperament that they would be pushing out code and releases very rapidly and very regularly. Right? So we have seen in kind of like the DevOps literature and lots of the transformational stuff in this space that actually small regular releases decrease the risk of any particular release, because you're decreasing the amount of moving parts that are going into that on a regular basis. And so we're trying to optimize our tooling and our world for teams to firstly be able to deploy something into a production environment very rapidly within a week, but also for them to regularly deploy into that environment, and that for that cadence to be part of what teams experienced in their development practices. And finally, just as a kind of measure of quality, and because I am an ops person, I really have an ops background, we were also looking for things like metrics around error codes to be very low. So HTTP 500 errors, often called "we've screwed up" errors from an ops perspective. You know, it's kind of like if one of these goes through the system, and in particular if it goes out to a user, the default usually lies in some kind of interaction of software and infrastructure and how that's being served up. So we were really looking to minimize those kinds of errors massively, and that's the kind of metrics we were kind of looking to optimize for. What was my role? Well, I was something called Digital Service Manager and System Security Owner. The reason that this is interesting is that I had security in my title because I was the System Security Owner, so my job was to ensure that across the system that we use to develop software, we embed security, but also Digital Service Manager, which essentially is a role that combines the product focus with the operational focus. So the idea was, my role was to own the way we delivered software and the way we did infrastructure and software development from a product and operational perspective. So, you know, I was as responsible for the availability of those systems as I was for the features that they presented. And the challenge, I guess, that all of this context kind of set for me was the following: how do we build a software development lifecycle that supports the growth that we were seeing, but embeds our organizational security needs? So HMRC, as you can imagine, has some significant security needs. We are holding large amounts of personal data about people. We're holding large amounts of financial data about people that's sensitive and that opens up the potential for fraud. The systems that we run have the ability to, I know HMRC usually is seen as taking in lots of money from people, but actually a number of the systems that we run have the ability to pay out money, and that makes them right targets for fraud. It makes them right targets for organized crime and for people who want to try and game those systems in order to make money from them. So these were the kinds of threats around data and fraud that we were kind of grappling with, and what we really didn't want to do was, in this growth, to open up the organisation to the risk of greater risks in that area. So that gives you an idea of the context that we were operating in, and I guess now what I'm just going to walk through in the next section is really the kinds of things we did to try and tackle that problem. So we're really going from a world where we have quite tight, co-located, high bandwidth communication, development and operations world, kind of some of the ideals of DevOps, if you like, those kinds of lots of sharing, lots of communication, and we're moving into, but very much based around the idea that we're all based in one space, and we can all have clear sharing, and we've got quite a lot of control over what our world looks like. Now, very, very quickly, we're going to move to a world where we're doing a lot more than that, and I guess this is how we dealt with it. And I'm going to go through 5 things. 5 points that that I grappled with, and kind of how I kind of went through those different areas. So I'm going to go through these one by one, and I'm going to be reasonably rapid about it. So here we go. 5 things I learned. So let's talk first about team structure. So when we sort of set out on this growth period, we kind of looked at the infrastructure, the tooling that we put in place to produce infrastructure for the initial 4 services that we had out there, and we kind of and the way we've done that is by having an infrastructure team, which got web operations team that worked reasonably closely with the 4 initial development teams that were building services to provide them with infrastructure for those services. Now, as we grew, we kind of had to make a decision as to what the team would look like and how it would change in response to many more teams emerging in the different locations. And really, as I saw it, we were going to sit somewhere on this continuum, right? So I've kind of made this up, but it's somewhat inspired by the very good website DevOps Topologies that gives you some ideas for different ways of operating in a DevOps context based around how you kind of run your teams. And I guess what I was sort of wondering was, at one end of the scale, it felt to me like there's a distributed DevOps model. And this is kind of where you put DevOps knowledge, skills, people into each of the product teams and give them a reasonable or maybe a great deal of autonomy in how they run their own software development world, right? And that's what I've called one end of the scale distributed DevOps. And at the other end of the scale are called centralized ops, which is kind of the other end of the scale, where you try and centralize the people, the tooling, the skills and the knowledge required to run effective operations and effective software delivery, and then kind of try and offer that out to teams kind of as a service, right? And sometimes this is encapsulated around things to do with platform as a service or infrastructure as a service. And I guess at one end, at the distributed DevOps end, you're kind of optimizing for autonomy of teams, right? Each product team gets to do what it wants. And I think in this kind of world, you get more freedom, you can potentially have quite a lot of speed, and teams can move very quickly when they have that autonomy to do things, and there's potentially a lot of creativity in that space as well. At the other end of the scale, you maybe are trading off some of the autonomy and some of the freedom in favor of consistency. So if you're trying to offer up a single, say, way of doing things that's centralized and trying to make that available to teams in a consistent fashion, you are maybe decreasing the amount of creativity and autonomy that teams have. The thing that was interesting to me was, how do we try and make sure that people are doing good things, right, in teams, and in particular, how are they meeting sort of standards that we have to meet for developing services? And I kind of felt like the distributed DevOps end of things required what I call sharing standards for emergence. So what it would require was for teams to each team to kind of maybe have to solve the problem again and again until a good enough solution had emerged that other teams were willing to kind of join and share the scale. I feel like there's maybe a dangerous position, which is where if you have a centralized perspective, you could enforce a particular way of doing things, right? And that kind of was dangerous. That's like what was in my mind as we set out. And really, the kind of picture I was kind of working to was this idea here. So my was that the yellow blob there is a kind of infrastructure or operations teams. The blue blobs our product teams, and my thought for the way that the interface between those two teams would operate would be through something like platform as a service. So that would be a set of tools or APIs or a single tool that teams could use to have a consistent approach to building software. So the kind of thinking that I had. The reason that I kind of wanted to move in this direction was because of that kind of dichotomy that I presented on the previous slide. It's to try and codify and make consistent what different teams were doing through a single interface. And I found, I guess, as we set out, I found that as a potentially less challenging task than the one of spreading the skills and the knowledge and the infrastructure kind of people and around what was emerging as many teams. Over time, and this is, I guess, a sort of theme of what I'm talking about, the thing changed quite dramatically. And what we actually found was that tooling alone, so the idea of platform as a service, as a kind of set of tools, would not achieve the things that we were looking to achieve. So actually, we ended up with a team structure that looked a little bit more like the following, where the yellow blob still represents an infrastructure team who are sort of building things around that infrastructure around that platform as a service and infrastructure as a service to provide out services to teams that would help them deliver software more rapidly. But around that, we needed a lot of additional services and useful bits and pieces that would help us codify what we were talking about. And so I guess this is the background to some of the other pieces that I'm talking about. And actually, the green blobs represent teams that emerged over time to tackle specific issues. So where we had a team maybe tackling how we were going to do governance or how we were going to input specific tools that matched some of our needs, those teams emerged over time and sort of fed in to the more general picture that we were offering, that went beyond tooling to encompass things like governance, things like patterns, how we can do things with best practice, and communities for discussing how we take those things forwards. So in terms of that line, where did we end up on that line? I kind of feel like this X sort of shows but we certainly weren't at the place where everything was enforced or driven through a kind of dry tooling sort of approach, even if that's possible. There were things emerged out of that where we couldn't solve problems fast enough through tooling, or we didn't know enough of them, and so we kind of had more people move into that space and more teams emerge to solve problems as we were going along. So that's just a little thought about where we went team-wise. I think it's important because of the kind of different ways that people are considered DevOps. It's good to be explicit about what you're aiming for in terms of the interaction between the different teams that you're operating within this space, and to be explicit about whether you are aiming for that kind of greater autonomy approach, or whether you're looking to, say, optimize for consistency. So that's the first point. The second point is how we thought differently about security, about the role of security in what we were doing. So to go back to what I was saying earlier, there's that kind of picture of security really sitting at a distance and kind of blocking or certainly applying their standards to whatever you're doing at maybe a late stage from a distance. in a kind of asynchronous fashion, and you having to respond to that. And certainly in the way that we delivered software in HMRC prior to using to digital ways of doing things, that was the kind of process. You know, it was very sort of distinct. It was very distinct grouping that kind of cast an eye over what you're doing, and then gave you a set of things that you had to kind of try and implement, and really made things quite challenging for you. And there was not a great deal of transparency about where those kinds of requirements came from, and there wasn't a great deal of help in how you were going to work them out. It was just kind of something that was laid, you know, that was kind of dropped onto your project that you kind of had to work through. What we tried to do in our growth phase, and I think what we did reasonably successfully, was think differently about the role of security. And I really think about these things pictorially, but I'm very bad at drawing pictures, as you've seen from the previous slides. So this is another unsophisticated picture that I drawn that tries to get in place what I was thinking about. So in my mind, my role, both from the kind of infrastructure and operations kind of perspective, and also from the security perspective, was to try and enable flow. And this picture kind of establishes kind of what I was trying to do there. In my mind, what I was trying to build was a box such that when people were inside the box, they could move rapidly. They could deliver services rapidly in HMRC. But when they fell outside of the box, that was when we had to apply more thought to the kinds of things that they were doing. And I guess what I was trying to do was to make it as easy as possible to operate within the box for the kinds of things that we were doing. That kind of sounds a little bit oblique, so let me sort of go through a bit more what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about a box, I guess I'm talking about there are lots and lots of decisions that you kind of have to make when building, say, infrastructure or tooling around your software delivery lifecycle, and all the way through into maintaining and sort of monitoring services, live services, right? And all of those decisions, to me, constitute the box that you're building, right? And these questions are just a small set. They're just a few that I can kind of thought up. But they're the kinds of things that we would use to kind of define what kinds of things we are optimizing our system to deliver, right? So if you think about what kind of code can you deploy, you know, if we can deploy any kind of code, then the number of things we need to do in order to maintain systems that are secure, that are effective, that are available for that is greater, right? Because if I have to understand how Ruby packages work, and how Python packages work, and how Node packages work, and how Scala packages work, that's going to be more work for me in building a consistent way of developing those services in all those languages than if I just have to do it for one of those languages, right? And that's the same for that kind of question, and that kind of sort of thinking goes across, cuts across a multitude of different angles. And some of them are quite technical. They're like, you know, what kinds of languages, what kinds of versions of stuff are we writing, what kinds of databases, say, what kinds of data stores. Some of them are more about how we operate as a organization. So how do people get code into production, and what kinds of checks have to occur. The kind of box that I'm talking about was an articulation of our way of doing these things, right? And the key thing that I was trying to establish is that if we can answer these questions in a particular way, we can give people a way of flowing through the process more rapidly, right? So putting in constraints in this world can enable flow, And the reason for that is that if we know, and it's kind of like I said before, if we know that we are optimizing for delivering, say, Scala applications of a particular framework, let's say play framework, let's say of version X, Y, or Z, it reduces the amount of work we have to do in order to, say, understand the threat profile for that particular set of things. It reduces the amount of work we have to do to ensure that people can consistently build services in that way. And every time that we put in place a security control or something that's beneficial from security, it reduces the number of ways in which we have to, it reduces the number of ways in which we have to change or alter or measure that thing onwardly to make sure that it's still applicable. So essentially, what we kind of went through in this period through a kind of set of iterations, and kind of quite painful, and you'll see some of them come up in a few of the next slides, iterations, is a collaborative process between the different teams that are involved in delivering software across that life cycle to try and put a box around the kind of software that we wanted to deliver, right? And in terms of what that starting point was, well, we kind of started out, we sort of said, hey, the kinds of things that we're delivering are microservices, the kinds of things that we're delivering have this kind of architecture, they use this kind of audit pattern, they use this kind of authentication pattern. And by doing that, and by making that box sort of clear, we're able to sort of better understand what the threat profile is for our services, and to better understand when people can move faster through our delivery cycle. Because what I'm trying to do now in my role is to nudge everybody towards being inside of that box, right? So if you bring me if you're a product team and you're sort of designing a solution and you sort of think that you want to do something that's not inside of that box, well, the trade-off for you is that it's going to take longer, because things that sit outside of that box are going to need a more bespoke or more intense, skill-intense process for understanding how they fit into our world, whereas things inside of the box are the things that we are optimizing for in terms of the tooling we're making, in terms of the platform that we're developing, in terms of the other teams that are operating in that way, and in terms of the security controls we're putting in place. So where we started out was, could we define a small but clear box for delivering? And then as teams come along, could we push them into that box in order to make them flow faster? And really, some of the key things that determined the effectiveness of that box really were around security. Because of the things we've seen before, actually pinning down the kinds of controls we wanted to put in place and making them explicit and part of that box was a way of making it faster. One of the things this allowed us to do was to accredit services much more quickly. So because we had a clear understanding of what our box was and how it worked and the kinds of controls we were putting in place there, we were able to say that we were able to put in common controls for key threats that people would face, because we knew that if you were, say, building microservices with a particular architecture pattern, we'd already mitigated for certain threats in that kind of architectural pattern that we were setting up. Or if you were using our authentication pattern that was common to make things go faster, the authentication pattern had mitigated for certain threats that we were worried about. And so that's the kind of thing we were able to do, was then to make a lightweight procedure around accrediting services that said, hey, essentially, rather than discovering from scratch what the hell's going on about your service, what it enabled us to do was to put in place a single way of doing things for those services that you could tick against, that you could get an understanding of whether or not you were meeting very rapidly. And that brings me on to my next next point, which is that one of the key things for us to do once we'd established that box was to communicate it as simply as possible. So when we started out, because we were a close-knit, high bandwidth team, we were able to say things like, we're here to run stateless web apps. And people kind of knew, because of the sorts of things that they were building, that that meant we're here to run stateless web apps that don't master data, that don't have the master record for this particular service, or we're here to run stateless web apps that don't master data and use our auth architecture pattern. Right? Because of the shared connections we had and the amount of time that we'd gone into designing this across a close-knit team, we were able to communicate things hidden amongst the kind of words that we're using. But this wasn't going to work for us as we had more and more teams operating. One of the things that we found very, very effective in this space was a very simple technique of using checklists. So once we defined that box, we were able to create checklists that tried to make it explicit to each new team that was joining which things we cared about and in which direction we cared about them. So we were able to say things like, this is just a bit of an example, an extract from one of the things that we use, but are you storing data out for longer than 15 minutes, right? Are you doing something that's bigger than a session cache? If you're not doing that, if you're just using a session cache, then you can move faster, right? You can flow through the system because actually we've optimized for that kind of situation. If you need to do something more complicated with data for a longer period of time, we need to then get into working with you about that. Similarly with storing data, with the patterns that we were using, with onboarding, we could take each of the components that defined our box and turn them into a checklist. And the great thing about checklists is that it's a two-way communication device. From one perspective, it forced us to put our core sort of standards into simple language so that other people could consume that and understand where the boundaries of our system was. But the flip side of it was that when people filled this questionnaire out as part of their onboarding process and as part of their moving through the phases of delivery of their project, we were able to identify where to put our time and effort. Right? So we could see that services were going to do things that would step outside of the box, and we'd have to put more effort in those places. Right? And so that then allowed us as a group of kind of architects and infrastructure as an infrastructure team to kind of direct our effort towards people who were moving outside of the sort of flow box, or alternatively to try and nudge people back into that box in order to see whether we could work with them to deliver their service in a way that we'd optimize for, right? So they could move more quickly. The fourth bit, and I guess this is the bit that lots of people tend to focus on, but I guess for me the prior bits were the bits that tell you what to do in this part of the world, is about using code to implement those patterns and standards that you've developed. So when you come up with that box and you kind of say we're going to optimize for this sort of situation, you can then use code to make that happen. And there's lots of places in your world, in code, that you can do that. So there's CI and CD pipelines, cloud APIs, configuration, anywhere where code sits, you can use it to enforce or nudge people towards doing things in the way that you've defined as per your box. So let me give you a couple of examples. CI/CD pipelines. I'm a big fan of using pipelines to surface information early to people. One of the things that a team that worked around the platform in HMRC was able to do was to put in place this FBT plugin into builds to identify when people were using out-of-date libraries and alert them to that. And our initial kind of sort of view was, can we nudge people to away from using out-of-date libraries by early on in their build process? And remember, people are kind of doing releases very regularly, so they're doing kind of lots of builds and things to flag that they need to update this, and then make it a small task early on, get them knowledgeable about it early on and make it a small task before it becomes a big deal to have to upgrade some core libraries. that was a very successful project. That's available on GitHub under the HMRC org, and that was one of the ways that we were able to kind of keep, get an idea of where people were in their with their dependencies, with out-of-date versions of libraries, but do it in a way that we could just nudge people towards doing the right thing early on. Another thing that we did quite a lot of work with was building plugins like the OWASP ZAP plugin into build pipelines, so that at earlier stages in the build process, people would get an idea of their vulnerabilities to the OWASP top 10. This one was somewhat less successful than the dependencies element, and the main reason was we found that people found it difficult to interpret what the information that was coming out of the plugin, right? So actually, the level of awareness of the top 10 security vulnerabilities that OWASP tracks was not good enough for teams, generally speaking, to take that information and just act on it immediately. So actually what we found was this kind of initiative, which sort of brought really great information to teams very, very quickly, needed to be accompanied with quite a lot of education as to how you deal with those things, how you deal with those vulnerabilities. So that education was much easier for us because we constrained some of the other areas. So because we were in general using Scala and building around the Scala and Play frameworks, we were able to show people specific ways that they could improve what they were doing. And just finally in this space, we also, I said earlier, we had to do a lot around sort of detecting fraud and understanding what was going on from a fraud perspective. And so one of the other key things we were able to do was to build and issue out libraries that gave people a base level of understanding of the, base level of collection of information that was used in analyzing fraud and other logs. The final point I'm going to make, and then I'll just wrap up, is that there's a real worry in this way of operating, where you kind of are constraining the set of things people can do and optimizing for a particular set of things. Now, it can massively increase the speed at which you can deliver the software by taking those common threats and building things around them, as I kind of just shown, that kind of help mitigate against those common threats that everybody's going to be seeing, and then nudging people towards ways that they can use those mitigations effectively. The problem is that it tends to be constraining of what people can do, and as I said earlier when we looked at that continuum of ways of doing DevOps, there is a tendency for things to become controlling and not allow for freedom. And I think the key thing from my perspective, and this is kind of, I guess, where a bit of that communication and those checklists and sort of getting that information out from the teams you're working with comes into it, right? So one of the questions we have very, very early on, and we kind of got through this cycle very quickly, one of the things we did early on was just allow people to store data in a cache for 15 minutes for a session cache. And the reason we did that was that actually in HMRC we wanted people to push data back into back-end systems so that it could be used against other bits of software that are running. As you can imagine, HMRC has a lot of stuff going on, and we didn't want people to suddenly be mastering data in our digital services without giving some thought into how that interacted with services in other places in the organization. So the thing that we set up was just a cache. Actually, lots of people quite quickly butt their head against this because they were doing things like allowing people to fill out forms over a period of time in the knowledge that actually the users, the taxpayers, wouldn't necessarily have all the information that they needed to complete that form in that time. And so a 15-minute cache wiping all of the data that you'd filled in up to that point was really not useful and not kind of fulfilling what people needed from that service. So we had to go through the cycle where we introduced a new database cluster that had different controls around it, sat in a different security zone, and had different kind of mitigations for storing data for 30 days. But what it meant was, by going through that process, we were able to enhance the set of things that we were offering people by giving them a new endpoint. But also we were able to treat the two cases as interestingly different from a threat profile. So the session cache had different controls in place around it to the data store for 30 days. And that meant that the measures that we were taking were most appropriate to the kinds of threats that sort of system was going to face. So that's my those are my 5 points. I guess I just wanted to summarize a few takeaways, and I guess the first thing was about the box. Really, if you can optimize for a widely used case, you can put in common threat mitigations and common sort of patterns that allow people to move faster. And so you can push people to building things in a particular way and nudge them in that direction, and thereby increase the velocity at which they deliver services. The other thing, the thing that we found very, very effective was to turn those use cases, that way of doing things, into patterns and communicate them out, so that everybody knew where your standards were and where your red lines were, and what the lines of your box were. The thing we then took, and I guess this is the classic kind of DevOps sort of automation sort of angle, is you can turn those things into code. You can make them part of your CI pipelines. You can make them part of the environments that you build. You can make those common threat mitigations, and they're more valuable because you know that more and more services will be using it. But the thing you have to watch out for is that you may be constraining the set of things that people want to do, and really allowing and having a good way to sort of get information out to people as to where they're butting against the edges of your model, and then giving a way of breaking out of that and building new services that enhance the rest set of things that you can do with appropriate controls, allows you to kind of grow the capability around your platform. So that's the end of my talking right now. So if there are any questions that have come through the session, I can take those. Okay, so I think we haven't had any. So what I'm going to do is hand back over to Adele to finish off. Oh, wait a sec, there may be.
We have a question, Kalbir, about AWS security best practices. What about AWS security best practices?
So that's quite a wide ranging question. So I'll just give a tip of an answer, and then I'll sort of direct you to get in touch with me more directly to look at more specific areas. So I think that the cloud, and AWS in particular, gives us an opportunity to do a lot more rapidly, right? So that's kind of like the key transformative element that it's brought into play, is that things that took a long time to do before are very, very quick. And so our tendency when we start off is to kind of just do stuff, and that's great because you can get things up and running very quickly. And there's reasonable measures built into what you might do, but actually getting to a good place in security in something like AWS needs a bit of different thinking to how you did things before, because there's a different threat surface and there's different bits. So there are APIs and things that have different functions. There are different kind of roles that users can have, and that's kind of different to when we've been dealing with, say, physical infrastructure that has more constrained access controls and things like that. So the first thing I'd say is actually there's a range of things that you need to think about from a threat surface differently. The second thing I'd say is that AWS security best practices are codified by AWS in a kind of 50-page PDF, and there's number of things. There's many things you can do to automate those best practices, and really that's what we have been working on at DRIE and really focusing on is how do you take those security best practices and make them as automated as possible by integrating them into the software development lifecycle. And so things like making sure that all communication is over SSL, making sure all TLS, making sure that all environments are patterned in a way so you know that you're getting consistency and that they're isolated for other things that you're doing, so that you know that things in environment A can't affect environment B. And these are all very possible, and AWS have documentation around how to do that. But I'm slightly disappointed, I guess, in the fact that there's not more built in to just do this. But I'm not that disappointed because it gives us at DRIE an opportunity to help people get there through the tooling that we've built. Okay, so I think that is the end of the session. So thank you everybody for listening to me for the last 50 minutes or so, and thanks to eSynergy for setting this up. And if you have any questions about that kind of organizational approach to DevOps and how you can sort of use sort of organizational structures and quite simple methods to bring together different parts of the organization to enhance the security around your DevOps practice, then do get in touch. I'd love to talk to people about that. And thank you very much for your time.